Hey, David, I admire your map that you did of Shoreline, of the way it looked when the first people were here, and the interpretation of the different areas and different colors. And I understand that there were, some of the first people would put their canoes from over their heads, pull them out of the water in Lake Washington, and carry them over across what is now Shoreline, stop at Ronald Bog and pick the cranberries, and then keep going over to the beach, to what is now called Richmond Beach, and put their canoes back in the water after getting some kinnick, of course, and then doing their fishing in the saltwater. And that's just one example of how the land was serving the people. Your map tells so much more. Could you tell us a little bit more about it?
One of the things that struck me in putting together this map, I put it together from the earliest maps that were drawn of the area, and that was in the late 1850s when they were surveying, the government land office was surveying the land in order to have settlers be able to locate their claims. They had 320 acre claims, or 180, whatever amount of land that they wanted to claim. They needed to be able to locate it on a map precisely so you didn't have overlap. And so the surveyors were out surveying townships and section lines. And when they would do that, they would record the timber and just the land, lay of the land in their little register books that are about this big. And so that later people would know where they had been. So they would measure off all these straight lines in this very uneven territory, which was quite an accomplishment. So they laid down this geographical grid on the landscape. Well, in the process of doing that, sometimes when they would have 88-foot chains, 100 links long, 80-foot chains, and that's how they measure the land in terms of chains. And so they had a compass, and they would lay out the chains, and then they would, in the register book, say, well, from this point, you go north, so many links on the chain, and there's a cedar tree. And if the cedar tree was on the line of the chain, you couldn't go around it because then that would bend the chain and therefore lessen the length. And so you had to measure the diameter of the cedar tree. So you had to so then they recorded the diameters of the trees and what the tree was, or the species of the tree. And that was continuous, so all their measurements. So what we can do with these register books is we can reconstruct the original forest cover. They also describe the undergrowth, and they also describe the soil type. And so these are extraordinary documents. They weren't just for surveying and measuring off the land. They described the land as well. And one of the things that they described was when they would enter burns, areas that had been burned. And then they would enter them, and then they would exit them. And so these are located in the maps. Well, when you have all these section lines with all this information, you can plot the direction of the burns. And usually the burns go in the direction the wind was blowing when the fire was set and when the fire burned. And there's a number of them in Shoreline, and some of them were older burns, and that were mentioned in the register book as this is an older burn, and then some of them were more recent. And it's been estimated that 60% of the land in the Puget Sound Basin was regularly burned over, 60%. So what that did was produce a mosaic of landforms. And the reason why it was burned over was because, and this would happen every 2, 3, or 4 years, and that was because the forests, if allowed to do their forest thing, would essentially become so dense that they would block sunlight from the ground, and then that would alter the understory of vegetation, particularly the shrubby plants. So deer and elk don't feed on grass, they feed on shrubs. So if you space the trees out so that enough sunlight comes in, you'll have much more growth of shrubby plants, which means more food for deer and elk and other animals as well. And so this burning had been going on since before the forests had actually established themselves here. Fires were lit to direct game when they were being hunted. Fires were lit to burn over meadows after plants had been collected so that the same plant would come back. And now, then about 5,000 years ago, when the forests began to spread in this area, it was once an open savanna, as the forests began to spread, the people used fire to basically mitigate that and keep enough open space so that they could have enough game animals to hunt and eat. And so we have these maps that show, we can create these maps that show where the burns were, the more recent ones. And there's a big long north one, that's the entire north-south width of Shoreline. There's a number at Echo Lake and Lake Ballinger. There are some down in Ballard, and then there's some in Ravenna. My house that I lived in, my wife, family, and I lived in for 40 years, was right on one of these burns. And the amazing thing was I could go along the section line, which is Northeast 85th Street, and I could locate precisely where the surveyor had said there was a snag so many inches in diameter right on the section line. Now the snag has been gone for over 100 years, but I could locate precisely on the street where it had been. So it's like a ghostly reality. But what the reality was it was not a wilderness like we're often, just as it's often described, but it was a garden that the people had maintained and cultivated. So in 1792, when George Vancouver came here, and he was stunned by the beauty of the landscape, and he said, and he wrote in his log, I cannot imagine a land so beautiful that has not been cultivated. He said, all it requires is cultivation and the erections of mansions to be the most beautiful land that could possibly be imagined. Well, what he was looking at was not a land that nature alone had produced, but that nature and human beings had together produced, that they were in league in creating an environment that was more suitable for human beings. And that Vancouver thought was exquisitely beautiful, and it was. And so these register maps give us a glimpse of what that land looked like and how rich it was. And that's why creating the map was so exciting, because it's like it was one way to get back to see that. I mean, when you look around today, it's hard to imagine what it was like. There's lots of trees, but they're scattered about. There was a pattern in the landscape that bore the imprint of human beings. And to recognize that gives us a sense of communion with these earlier people that we would not otherwise have.